I stood outside the glass doors of the ballroom, smoothing the wrinkles of my navy dress that I'd ironed twice that morning. The fabric was simple cotton, soft from years of careful washing, and the pearls at my neck were the only ones I'd ever owned passed down from my mother, not bought. Through the shimmering glass, I could see them, Dylan in his tuxedo, tall and proud, the same boy I had raised through every scraped knee and sleepless night. Beside him, Jessica shone like a diamond hair perfectly sculpted, dress glittering with tiny crystals that caught every flash of light. She looked like she belonged in a magazine. I looked like I had wandered in from a different world. As the usher opened the door for me, the air inside hit me perfume, laughter, the clinking of champagne flutes. Every table was draped in white silk and gold. A live quartet played near the stage, their music soft but expensive. People turned when I walked in, their glances slid over me like invisible knives. I heard whispers, "Who's that?" And then one woman said it out loud, "That must be the groom's mother. Poor thing." I smiled, the kind of smile you give when you pretend not to hear. Jessica spotted me halfway through her conversation with her bridesmaids. Her eyes flickered just for a second, and then she put on that dazzling social grin. "Oh, Emily," she said loudly, "you made it." She kissed the air near my cheek. "We were worried you'd get lost. The estate can be confusing for newcomers." Her friends tittered, hands covering their lips. I said nothing. My fingers clutched my small clutch purse tighter. Dylan came over, relief spreading across his face. "Mom, you look beautiful," he said, and for that moment, everything softened. I wanted to believe love could shield me from humiliation. But I saw Jessica's eyes narrow as Dylan hugged me, as though even affection from him was something she now owned. Dinner was a performance. Courses arrived like artwork, lobster bisque, steak with truffle butter, champagne poured endlessly. I tasted nothing. Across the table, Jessica's parents, Robert and Paula Reynolds, asked polite questions. "So, Emily," Paula said with a rehearsed warmth, "what line of work were you in before retirement?" Before I could answer, Jessica interjected sweetly, "Oh, she didn't really work. My husband says she took care of the home." She said it as if it were an old-fashioned hobby. The table chuckled lightly. I folded my napkin and said, "That's true. I took care of everything home, accounts, and a husband who built something that changed lives." Her brows twitched. Paula blinked. Robert gave a polite nod, uninterested. When the speeches began, I thought the night would finally pass without more cruelty. The best man toasted, people clapped, glasses clinked. Then Jessica took the microphone. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began, radiant under the lights. "Especially my new family. My husband's mother, Emily, she's so humble. She insisted on wearing something simple so she wouldn't draw attention away from us." Laughter rippled across the hall. Jessica smiled wider. "It's sweet, really. Not everyone can understand our lifestyle, but she tries." The sound that followed wasn't just laughter, it was pity disguised as politeness. I felt my face burn. My son looked stricken, caught between pride and shame. He reached for my hand under the table, but I pulled it away gently. I couldn't let him see how much it hurt. Every word from Jessica was a nail in my composure, hammered with charm. She thought I was powerless, a nobody sitting under chandeliers that she believed belonged to her kind. Robert laughed softly but then fell quiet, his gaze fixed on me. I saw something in his eyes shift: curiosity, confusion. He studied me the way a man studies a memory he can't quite place. The orchestra resumed. People clapped, glasses rose. The night went on. I excused myself, stepping outside into the cool garden air. Fireflies blinked above the trimmed hedges, the laughter inside muffled into a hum. I stood there, breathing slowly, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. For years I had lived quietly, protecting what was mine not out of fear, but choice. My late husband Andrew had been an inventor, brilliant but restless. His device had powered small towns after storms, brought light to hospitals running on backup generators. When he died, I promised him I would keep his work alive. What Jessica's family didn't know, what even Dylan didn't know, was that their empire survived because of me. Because once, long ago, a desperate man named Robert Reynolds had called a private investor for help, and I had answered. But I said nothing. Not yet. Silence was my armor, humility my disguise. Let them think I was small, let them laugh. I had learned that the loudest in the room are often the most fragile. The ones who underestimate you, those are the ones you never warn. When I returned inside, Jessica was posing for photos, her hand draped around Dylan's arm like a prize ribbon. She turned when she saw me. "We're taking family pictures, Emily," she said brightly. "But maybe you can join later once the formal shots are done." My throat tightened. My son hesitated. I nodded. "Of course," I said softly. She smiled, triumphant, then turned back to the camera. I stood there, watching my own son smile for a picture that didn't have room for me. As the flash went off, Robert's gaze met mine again. This time he looked almost pale, his lips parted, and for a split second recognition flickered in his eyes. But before he could say anything, the photographer called for another pose, and the moment vanished into the glitter of lights. I slipped out before the dancing began. Outside, the night smelled like rain and roses. I could still hear their laughter echoing faintly through the windows. My reflection in the glass was small, ghost-like. I thought of Andrew. I thought of the promise I had made, and then I whispered to myself, not in anger, but in quiet disbelief, how could my own family do this to me? The morning after the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table with a chipped cup of tea, the quiet pressing against me like a comfort I didn't deserve. The flowers from the ceremony lay in a vase beside me, wilting roses that still smelled expensive. I traced the rim of my cup and thought of Andrew, my late husband, and the promise I had made to him years ago. Stay small in the world, but large on paper. Andrew was a man who could fix anything except his own health. He spent his life building a small device that could power homes when the grid failed. A simple invention that ended up saving lives in storm zones. When he died, people called it luck, but it wasn't luck. It was years of cold dinners, patched clothes, and nights when I worked 2 jobs to fund his experiments. I still remember our tiny apartment paint peeling, rain dripping through the ceiling, and the way Andrew smiled when his machine finally hummed to life. That sound was our symphony. When the first patent check came, Andrew wanted to celebrate. We split 1 steak and a bottle of cheap wine. He said, "This is only the beginning." And it was. Within 5 years, the technology was licensed worldwide. We could have lived like royalty, but Andrew preferred simple things, coffee from the same chipped mug, walks through the park, tinkering in his shed. I learned to value modesty as our shield. He used to say, "Real wealth isn't seen, it's felt." After he passed, I buried myself in the business. I read every contract, every clause. Men tried to talk circles around me, but I learned their language and outweighed their arrogance. When storms hit, hospitals and shelters called for our device. I kept every letter of gratitude in a folder marked light. The money came in quietly, and I invested just as quietly small companies, honest work. I never appeared in photos, never lent my name, only initials, E. Collins. Then came the winter call that would change everything. A man's voice trembled on the phone. "Mrs. Collins, my company's collapsing. We make generators for clinics. If we close, hundreds lose power." His name was Robert Reynolds. I read his books overnight and saw both brilliance and recklessness. His company could be saved, but only by someone who understood the math of mercy. I signed the deal, becoming the silent investor who owned more than half his shares. He never saw my face. To him, I was only a wire transfer that saved his empire. People think wealth changes you. It doesn't. It changes the way others look at you. So, I stayed quiet. I wore thrift store clothes, drove an old sedan, and lived in the same house Andrew built. I wasn't hiding from the world, I was protecting what mattered. Dylan grew up thinking we were comfortable but not rich. That's how I wanted it. He learned to work, to build, to see people for who they were, not what they owned. When Dylan met Jessica, I prayed she would see the same light in him that I did. But from the first dinner, I knew. She talked more about wine labels than memories, more about who she knew than what she loved. When she toured my home, her eyes lingered on the outdated curtains and old appliances. "You've kept things authentic," she said, smiling the way rich people do when they see something beneath them. Dylan didn't notice. Love blinds gently before it burns. I wanted to warn him, but Andrew's voice echoed in my head. Let him find his own lessons. So I stayed quiet. I made lemon bars she never finished and offered kindness she mistook for weakness. When the engagement came, Jessica's mother sent me a list of acceptable dress colors for the wedding, none too bold, none too visible. I laughed to myself and bought a navy dress I'd worn to 3 church fundraisers. I didn't need to stand out. I had already built more than anyone in that ballroom ever would. After the ceremony, when Jessica called me a nobody, I thought about the irony. Her father's company, her family's name, survived only because of the woman she mocked. But humiliation has a way of sharpening memory. That night, I opened my old blue ledger, the one with the frayed corners and fading ink. Inside were notes from every investment, every contract, every wire transfer. And there, near the middle, was Reynolds Energy Solutions, my initials beside his signature, proof that silence can be more powerful than pride. I flipped to the final page and found the quote Andrew had written years ago. "We make light." I traced the words with my finger, realizing that light doesn't argue. It reveals. It doesn't demand respect, it earns it, quietly, inevitably. Jessica's cruelty had cut deep, yes, but not enough to destroy me. I had endured harder nights, colder kitchens, deeper losses. What was one spoiled girl's insult compared to the years I spent building something that lasted? I stood by the window and watched morning sunlight break through the clouds. Somewhere, Jessica was probably still glowing in photographs, unaware that her future rested in the hands of the woman she had mocked. I could destroy her with one phone call. But revenge, I reminded myself, is a poor return on investment. Timing, however, is everything. I poured another cup of tea and smiled faintly. There would come a day when Robert Reynolds would remember my name not as Dylan's mother, but as the woman who once saved his world. And when that day came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. Truth has its own kind of volume. For now, I would keep my promise to Andrew, stay small in the world and large on paper. The first time I met Jessica, she arrived at my house wearing perfume that smelled like cold money, sweet, sharp, and proud of itself. She stood in my doorway holding a bottle of imported wine she didn't uncork, glancing around the small living room like it was an antique exhibit of ordinary lives. "What a cozy place," she said, her tone soft but her eyes restless, searching for something that wasn't there. No chandelier, no designer sofa, no proof that I belonged in her world. I smiled and told her to sit wherever she felt comfortable. She chose the edge of the couch, careful not to wrinkle her dress. Dylan hovered beside her, excited, protective. "Mom, Jessica's in marketing," he said, as if that explained the practiced charm in her every gesture. She laughed and touched his arm. "Not just marketing, babe brand storytelling," she corrected gently. "I help companies find their identity." She said it like she was performing, and I could almost hear the applause she expected. I nodded. "That's a useful skill," I replied. She didn't hear the quiet amusement in my voice. If only she knew the number of identities I'd created behind initials and trust accounts. We had dinner, baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and lemon bars for dessert. Jessica complimented everything except the food. "I love that you still cook," she said. "It's so traditional." She meant old-fashioned. Dylan didn't notice. He was too busy watching her laugh, that silvery laugh that made him believe she belonged to another, brighter world. I saw how she looked at him like he was a project she could rebrand into something shinier. After dinner, she offered to help wash dishes, but spent most of the time checking her reflection in the window. "Your son told me his father was an inventor," she said lightly. "Must have been hard after he passed." I smiled, rinsing a plate. "It was, but work kept me busy." She tilted her head. "Dylan said you manage the finances. You must be good with numbers." "Numbers," I said softly, "are just another language for truth." She didn't ask what I meant. People like her rarely do. When they left, I stood by the door and watched Dylan help her into the car. She didn't look back. I told myself it was too soon to judge, that maybe she was just nervous, but deep down, I knew. I'd spent a lifetime reading people not from their words, but from the pauses between them, and Jessica's pauses were filled with calculation. As the months passed, the distance began to grow not just between Jessica and me, but between Dylan and the home that built him. Calls became shorter, visits less frequent. When they did come, Jessica planned every moment. Restaurants too loud for real conversation, expensive gifts I didn't need, holidays where she decided the menu before I could ask. Once, she brought a set of silver forks and said cheerfully, "So you can upgrade your tableware. Presentation matters." I wanted to tell her I once negotiated a 7-figure deal with a pen I borrowed from a bank counter, but I simply said, "Thank you, dear. I'll keep them for special occasions." She never realized every word from me was its own kind of mirror, polite, clear, and reflecting back everything she couldn't see about herself. Dylan tried to bridge the gap, bless him. He'd call and ask, "Mom, do you like Jessica?" I always said yes. It wasn't a lie, not completely. I liked the part of her that made my son smile. But I also saw the way she chipped away at his confidence, the small corrections she slipped into his sentences, the subtle way she guided every decision. Love can become a leash when one person keeps adjusting its length. When the engagement came, Jessica called me first. Her voice was syrup-sweet. "We're so excited, Emily. We want you there for everything, but of course, we'll handle the arrangements. You just enjoy yourself." I could hear the unspoken words. "We'll control everything." I thanked her and asked where they planned to hold the ceremony. "At my parents' estate," she said proudly. "They've hosted fundraisers for senators there. It'll be elegant." The word elegant lingered in her tone like a locked door I wasn't meant to enter. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the signs of exclusion came dressed as politeness. Jessica's mother, Paula, sent me an email with style guidelines for the bridal party and guests. "We're aiming for a cohesive aesthetic," she wrote. "Soft pastels only. No navy, no black, nothing that distracts from the family." I laughed when I read it, then chose navy anyway. It was Andrew's favorite color, and I never asked permission to honor my husband. The bridal shower invitation came last, almost as an afterthought. Jessica greeted me at the door with air kisses. Her friends looked me up and down as if trying to place what brand I might be wearing. When I handed Jessica a small box inside, a handmade lace handkerchief that had belonged to my mother, she smiled politely. "That's sweet," she said. Then one of her friends handed her a diamond bracelet, and she gasped, "Now this is perfect." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I just folded my hands and thought how easily people mistake shine for substance. Dylan called that night, apologetic. "Mom, Jessica didn't mean to hurt you. She's just nervous about everything being perfect." I said, "I understand." He exhaled in relief, not realizing the understanding I offered wasn't forgiveness. It was strategy. Sometimes silence is not weakness, it's the rope you let out before you pull it tight. The final rehearsal before the wedding confirmed what I already knew. Jessica asked me to stand on the far end of the family photos, so the color balance would look better. Her mother nodded approvingly. Dylan didn't see the insult, but I caught Robert watching. He didn't laugh, but he didn't stop them either. That told me more about him than any business report I'd ever read. On the drive home, I thought about the Reynolds family, their wealth, their pride, their illusion of control, and how small they really were beneath the marble and chandeliers. I had once promised Andrew I'd never use money to hurt people, but now I realize that truth doesn't hurt, it humbles. That night, I placed my wedding invitation inside my ledger, between the pages that held the Reynolds contract. The same signature mine linked both documents. One celebrated their future, the other owned it. I smiled faintly at the symmetry. People often say they want to marry into wealth. Jessica had done it, she just didn't know whose. The week before the wedding, the air around me felt heavier, like the world had decided to test how far grace could stretch before it tore. Jessica called daily with updates that weren't really updates, more like commands disguised as courtesy. "Emily, we've decided the seating arrangements," she said one morning, her voice brisk. "We thought it'd be better if you sat at the back near the garden doors, closer to the restrooms, for comfort." I smiled into the receiver, though she couldn't see me. "How considerate," I replied. She hung up before I could ask who I'd be sitting with. When the final wedding plans arrived by email, my name wasn't on the family photo list. Instead, there was a polite footnote: "Additional portraits will be taken after the formal session if time allows." I knew what that meant. It wasn't an oversight, it was exclusion neatly typed in cursive font. I closed the laptop and stared at the quiet room around me, the same walls that had held laughter, birthdays, and late-night storms of grief. For a moment, I wondered if Andrew would have handled it differently. Then I remembered the calm certainty in his voice whenever people underestimated him. He'd smile, fix the broken wire, and say, "Let them think it's nothing until it works." The bridal luncheon was held at an upscale restaurant overlooking the bay. When I arrived, Paula Reynolds, perfect hair, perfect pearls, stood to greet me with a cool smile. "Emily, how lovely you could join us. Jessica mentioned you prefer simpler things, so we ordered you a salad without dressing." I looked at the plate in front of me, bare greens glistening under the light, and nodded. "Thank you, Paula. You've thought of everything." Jessica laughed softly. "Mom's just teasing," she said, but her eyes sparkled with that same satisfaction children get when they break something fragile and blame the wind. Throughout the meal, conversations swirled around luxury honeymoons, designers, and real estate. I listened quietly, offering the occasional polite murmur. One of Jessica's friends turned to me. "So, Emily, what line of work were you in?" Dylan never said. I smiled. "Oh, nothing glamorous. Just family investments." Jessica chimed in quickly. "She means she manages her savings. She's very modest." There it was again, modest, a word that to people like her meant small, harmless, insignificant. I stirred my tea and said softly, "Yes, modesty can be powerful when used correctly." The table fell silent for a second before laughter resumed, forced and brittle. That night, Dylan stopped by my house. He looked tired but excited, his tie crooked, his face glowing with the kind of love that blinds a man to warnings. "Mom, I know Jessica can be particular," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But she means well. Her family just does things differently." I set down my knitting. "Differently doesn't always mean better, darling. Just louder." He sighed, half smiling. "You're old-fashioned, Mom." I nodded. "And you'll find one day that old-fashioned usually survives the storm." Still, I kept my peace. The night before the ceremony, I ironed my navy dress and polished my mother's pearls. They were small but real, unlike the glass ones Jessica wore, glittering like promises she'd never keep. I tucked the invitation into my purse beside a folded piece of paper, the original stock certificate of Reynolds Energy Solutions. I didn't know why I brought it. Maybe it was a reminder to myself, not to them, that quiet power doesn't vanish just because no one applauds it. The wedding morning arrived wrapped in sunlight that felt almost cruel in its brightness. The Reynolds estate was enormous white marble columns, trimmed hedges, and fountains that whispered wealth. Valets opened car doors as if touching royalty. Inside, servers glided by with champagne flutes balanced like crystal feathers. I walked alone through the foyer, my modest clutch in hand, the scent of lilies and expensive perfume tangling in the air. When Paula saw me, her expression flickered between politeness and discomfort. "Oh, Emily, you're here early," she said, glancing at her watch. "The ceremony starts in an hour." I smiled. "I like to be on time. It's a habit from a simpler life." Her lips tightened. Jessica appeared moments later, radiant in lace and arrogance. "Emily, the florist placed your corsage incorrectly," she said sharply, plucking it from my wrist and handing it to a bridesmaid. "We'll fix it later. We can't have clashing colors in photos." I nodded, biting back the instinct to laugh. To her, colors mattered more than kindness. As the guests arrived, whispers followed me like shadows. Some faces were curious, others pitying. I caught fragments: the groom's mother, such plain clothes. Maybe they're middle class. They weren't cruel so much as careless, the way people are when they're sure you'll never matter to their story. I kept my back straight, my hands folded, and found my seat by the garden doors. just as Jessica had arranged. The view was beautiful, the kind of beauty people mistake for peace. The ceremony itself was flawless, at least on the surface. Jessica glided down the aisle, every eye fixed on her. Dylan's face was pure devotion. When they exchanged vows, my heart swelled with love for my son and pity for the woman he thought he knew. I wanted to believe that love could soften her, that maybe the cruelty was just insecurity disguised as confidence. But I'd seen too much of the world to mistake polish for character. After the ceremony, as guests drifted toward the ballroom, Jessica's friends cornered me near the champagne table. "Emily, dear," one of them said, "you must be so proud. Did you ever imagine your son would marry into the Reynolds family?" I smiled. "Pride isn't about who you marry, it's about who you become." They blinked, not understanding. Before I could excuse myself, Jessica's voice cut across the room. "Mother, can you believe Dylan's mom doesn't even own a smartphone? She still uses a flip phone." Laughter rippled through the air. I froze, the glass trembling slightly in my hand. Dylan turned, startled. "Jess, that's not funny." She waved him off. "Oh, relax, it's cute." "She's so, what's the word, vintage." My son looked helpless, and for the first time I saw confusion in his eyes, the smallest crack in the illusion she'd built. I took a slow sip of champagne and said, "You're right, Jessica. I prefer things that last." The room went quiet just long enough for the meaning to settle before the music began again. Later, when the guests danced and laughed, I slipped outside to the terrace. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of rain. I looked back through the glass at the golden light spilling over the crowd, my son's new world, glittering and shallow. Inside, Jessica glowed under chandeliers her family believed they owned. Near the back, Robert Reynolds stood still, his glass untouched, his gaze fixed on me. For the briefest moment, confusion crossed his face, followed by a flicker of recognition. Then someone spoke to him, and the mask returned. I turned toward the garden, breathing in the cool air. Every insult, every whispered slight had built a kind of quiet armor around me. I no longer felt humiliated, only ready. The game had begun, and I finally remembered the rules. Let them have their spotlight. I owned the power grid. By the time the reception began, I had already memorized every chandelier's reflection, every laugh that wasn't kind, every glance that slid over me as if I were an inconvenience in someone else's fairy tale. I had thought I was ready for anything. I wasn't ready for how cruel beauty can sound when it decides to speak. The ballroom was a sea of gold light and champagne bubbles. Waiters moved like dancers, serving plates so polished I could see my face in them. Jessica sparkled in her new dress, a second gown for the evening white silk threaded with tiny pearls. Dylan stood beside her, adoring and oblivious. They looked perfect. Perhaps that's why she thought she could afford to be cruel. Dinner began with applause, speeches, and the clinking of forks against crystal. Robert and Paula Reynolds toasted to the union of two great families. The words felt rehearsed. I raised my glass politely, thinking how odd it was to hear the word family from people who didn't believe I was one of them. The waiters cleared the plates. The band began to play a soft melody. Jessica rose, her glass in hand, her face glowing in the warm light. "Before the music starts," she said, "I just want to thank everyone who made this day so special." Her voice carried easily across the room. "My parents for their endless support, my friends for keeping me sane." Then she turned her head toward me. "And of course, my new mother-in-law, Emily." She paused, smiling that perfect, poisonous smile. "She's been such an inspiration. She taught me that even when you come from humble beginnings, you can still raise a son worthy of a Reynolds." The laughter began softly, then louder. I felt the sound crawl up my spine. My son froze beside her, his eyes widening, but she continued as if reading from a script only she found amusing. "It's so sweet how she wanted to keep things simple," Jessica added, her gaze sweeping over my plain dress. "I told her not to worry about blending in, that this family welcomes everyone, even simplicity." It wasn't the words, it was the tone, that sharp, sugary tone that sliced through any pretense of kindness. People shifted uncomfortably. Some pretended to sip their drinks. Others smiled awkwardly. Paula laughed too loudly, trying to make it sound like a joke. I stared at my hands, the pearls at my wrist trembling faintly with each heartbeat. Dylan leaned in and whispered, "Mom, I'm so sorry." I smiled at him, steady, composed, the way you smile before the tide rises over your head. "Don't be," I said softly. "Let her finish." Jessica wasn't finished. "I mean, really, who needs status or money when you have such character?" she said brightly. I told Dylan he's lucky to come from such down-to-earth roots. She didn't notice the way her father's expression changed, how his laughter faltered, how his eyes locked on mine. There was something in his gaze now, a faint spark of memory, the ghost of a name half remembered. The applause that followed was forced, hollow. I stood slowly, pretending to adjust my shawl. "Thank you, Jessica," I said, my voice calm enough to surprise even myself. "You're right, simplicity does have its advantages. It keeps one grounded when the world starts spinning too fast." A few guests turned their heads, sensing something beneath the surface. Jessica blinked, unsure how to respond. "Oh, of course," she said quickly. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant, dear," I said gently. "You've made it very clear." I sat back down, and for a moment there was silence. Then the band resumed. Conversation returned, hesitant at first, then growing louder to drown the discomfort. Jessica laughed too hard at something someone said. Dylan sat rigid beside her, shame radiating from him like heat. I excused myself quietly. No one noticed me slip through the crowd except Robert. He watched as I crossed the marble floor toward the garden doors. For a second, I thought he might follow, but he didn't. I stepped outside into the night air. The music inside softened into a muffled hum. The garden was lit by lanterns that swayed gently in the breeze. I walked along the stone path until I reached the fountain, where the sound of water drowned the noise from inside. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it was something older, steadier, a familiar current of control. I took a deep breath and looked up at the house, its windows glowing like a stage I had just stepped away from. They thought they had dismissed me. They had no idea the play had only begun. Behind me, footsteps approached. Robert Reynolds stood at the edge of the path, his face pale. "Mrs. Collins," he said quietly. The way he said it, the hesitation before my name, told me he had finally remembered. I turned slowly. "Good evening, Mr. Reynolds." He looked at me as though he'd seen a ghost. "It's you," he murmured. "I thought you looked familiar, but I couldn't believe." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "You were the investor, the one who saved your company," I finished for him. "Yes, I was." His mouth opened, then closed. He looked back at the house where his daughter laughed under the lights. "She didn't know," he said weakly. "No," I said, my voice calm. "None of you did, and that's exactly how I preferred it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fountain kept whispering. Somewhere inside, the band shifted to a faster song. Robert's shoulders sagged. "I owe you everything," he said quietly. "If you hadn't stepped in back then." I held up a hand. "You don't owe me anything, Robert. I didn't do it for you. I did it because the world needed the energy your company provided. I invested in purpose, not pride." I looked back toward the ballroom windows, where Jessica's reflection gleamed faintly against the glass. "But perhaps it's time pride learns who really kept the lights on." Robert swallowed hard. "I'm so sorry for what she said tonight." I smiled faintly. "Don't be. I've endured worse words from better people. But I will ask you one thing." He nodded. "Anything." "When your daughter learns the truth," I said, "let her come to that realization herself. Don't protect her from it. Humility is a lesson best learned in public." He didn't answer, just stared at me with a kind of frightened respect. When he finally walked away, I stood alone under the lanterns, the night air cool against my skin. Inside, laughter echoed again, hollow and glittering. I took one last look at the glowing windows and whispered, "Let them shine while they can." Then I turned and left. That night, as I placed my pearls back into their velvet box, I realized I felt no anger, only clarity. There is a moment when a storm stops being frightening and becomes something inevitable, even cleansing. I had been patient long enough. The time for silence was ending. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of rain tapped gently against the window, steady and patient, like an old friend reminding me of all the nights I had endured before. I sat at my desk, the small lamp casting a pool of light across the worn wood. Before me lay the blue ledger I had kept for decades, its corners frayed, its pages lined with the story no one in that glittering ballroom would ever believe. I ran my hand across the cover and opened it to the beginning. The handwriting was smaller then, careful and uncertain. The ink had faded to brown, but the memories behind each number were still sharp as glass. Every entry was a moment Andrew and I had clawed our way toward survival. I could see him there, sleeves rolled up, soldering tiny wires by the kitchen window while I boiled water for tea. Our apartment smelled of tin and hope. When the device finally worked, the light it gave off was weak but steady, and we stood there holding hands, as if we'd just created a star that belonged only to us. That small generator, barely bigger than a shoebox, would one day keep hospitals running and save premature babies through power outages. But in those early years, all we knew was exhaustion and love. Andrew believed in the kindness of systems. I believed in the cunning of people. Between us, we survived. When investors ignored him, I handled the paperwork, wrote letters, and studied the patterns of the men who made fortunes. I learned that money moved in silence, that true influence was built not by shouting but by watching who listened. When the first licensing deal came, Andrew wanted to tell the world. I told him to wait. The louder they know your worth, I said, the faster they'll try to steal it. He laughed but agreed. When he got sick, the hospital bills came faster than his lab results. I remember sitting beside him, the machines humming like broken lullabies. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Promise me you'll keep it safe, Em. Stay small in the world but large on paper. They won't come for what they can't see." I promised. It was the last promise I ever made to him, and the one I never broke. After he died, I kept the business alive, first through stubborn will, then through instinct. When others panicked, I bought. When others bragged, I sold. The ledgers grew thicker, the zeros longer, but the house remained the same. I drove the same car, wore the same coat. Wealth, to me, wasn't freedom, it was shelter. The world looks at widows like prey. I learned to hide in plain sight. I remember the day I found Robert Reynolds' letter. It was December, snow bending the branches outside the kitchen window. The envelope was thick, embossed with his company's logo. Inside was desperation, dressed as professionalism. His words were polite, but the truth bled through. Layoffs, debt, lawsuits. We are in need of immediate support to maintain operations. I could hear the fear between the lines. I made tea, sat by the fire, and read his financial statements twice. He had built something valuable but reckless, too proud to admit the walls were caving in. I saw potential where he saw ruin. The next morning, I called my attorney. "Tell him we'll buy 48%, I said, "but through a trust, no name." The attorney hesitated. "That's control, Mrs. Collins." I smiled. "Exactly." The meeting took place in a quiet office that smelled of burnt coffee and tired air conditioning. Robert was thinner then, younger, dressed like a man pretending not to be desperate. He shook my attorney's hand and thanked Mrs. E. Collins for her generosity. I sat behind mirrored glass, watching, unseen. His gratitude was sincere, his relief palpable. I almost pitied him. Almost. I wired the funds within the hour. He called it salvation. I called it strategy. Over the years, Reynolds' energy grew strong again, expanding, profiting, parading itself as a symbol of resilience. Robert built his reputation on integrity, philanthropy, family legacy. He never once wondered who had quietly kept the current running beneath it all. Every quarterly report was a performance, every public statement a debt of gratitude he didn't know he owed. And I preferred it that way. There's a kind of freedom in being underestimated. Still, sometimes I'd see his name in the papers, his photo at charity galas, his quotes about perseverance, and I'd smile, knowing he was reciting lines I'd once whispered to Andrew in the dark. Progress belongs to those who stay after everyone else leaves. It wasn't resentment I felt. It was amusement. Because I had no need for applause. I had proof. When Dylan grew older, I wanted him to inherit Andrew's kindness, not my caution. He loved designing things, bridges, buildings, dreams that needed foundations. I funded his education quietly through shell accounts, letting him believe scholarships covered the rest. I wanted him to build without the shadow of gratitude. To him, I was just a mother who worked hard and paid bills on time. That was enough. Then Jessica arrived like a storm pretending to be sunlight. I saw her once in a magazine spread before I met her, a charity luncheon photo, her smile as practiced as her posture. When Dylan brought her home, I felt something cold settle in my chest. I recognized ambition when I saw it, but she wasn't the kind that built things, she was the kind that fed on them. Still, I tried, for my son's sake. I hosted her, listened to her talk about brand value and social tiers, and smiled when she spoke of upgrading Dylan's life. I watched her study me, searching for flaws she could turn into warnings for him. She thought she was playing chess. She didn't realize she was on my board. Sometimes at night, I'd reread Andrew's letters, the ones written during his final months. In one, he wrote, "Light doesn't brag about being light, it just shines." That line came to me again as I sat in my study, listening to the rain. Jessica believed she could humiliate me into invisibility. But she didn't understand my invisibility was my power. Every investment, every quiet choice, every signed paper was a weapon she couldn't see coming. I flipped to the last page of the ledger. Beneath the neat columns of numbers, I added one new entry in careful handwriting. Reynolds Energy controlling interest, retained. Below it, I wrote another line, one meant for myself. Dignity is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. Outside, thunder rolled softly, distant but certain. I closed the book and leaned back, letting the memories settle. The storm inside me was changing, less grief, more purpose. The humiliation at that wedding had been the final push I didn't know I needed. For years I'd protected peace by staying quiet. But peace, I was learning, sometimes required a little noise. When I turned off the lamp, the room fell into darkness except for the faint glow from the power generator in the corner. It hummed softly, faithfully, still running after all these years. Andrew's light, my legacy. And soon, it would illuminate the truth for everyone who had mistaken my silence for absence. The morning after the wedding humiliation, the world outside felt washed clean. Rain had come during the night, leaving the streets slick and shining, every leaf glistening as if the world itself had been baptized. I sat by the window with my tea, the same blue cup I'd used for 20 years, and waited for the knock I knew would come. When it finally did, it wasn't soft. It was urgent, careful, and full of the kind of tension only guilt can bring. Robert Reynolds stood on my porch in the same tailored suit from the night before, his tie loosened, his eyes red. The mask of confidence he'd worn at the wedding was gone. He looked like a man who had finally remembered a debt too big to name. "Mrs. Collins," he began, his voice low, his hand gripping the doorframe. I didn't know." I stepped aside. "You do now," I said. He entered cautiously, like he was stepping into a confession booth. His gaze lingered on my modest furniture, the faded rug, the framed photo of Andrew on the mantel. "This is how you live?" he asked softly, almost to himself. I smiled faintly. "Comfort doesn't need to be loud." He sat across from me, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "When I saw you last night, I couldn't place it. But then, when you said those words about humility, I remembered the day my company nearly collapsed, the investor who saved us, the woman who never gave her name, E. Collins." He swallowed. "You were the one." I nodded. "I still am." He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You hold the controlling shares." "Yes." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy but clean, like truth finally stepping into the light. He took a breath. "Why didn't you ever reveal yourself?" "Because you didn't need to know," I said simply. "You got to rebuild your company. I got to fulfill my husband's vision. We both got what we wanted." He rubbed his forehead. "If I'd known, my God, if my daughter had known." I set down my cup. "Your daughter doesn't need knowledge, she needs humility, and that isn't something you can inherit, it's something you earn." Robert looked down, ashamed. "What she did last night was unforgivable." "Not unforgivable," I said, "just unforgettable." He gave a weak laugh, then sighed. "She's always been proud, too proud. I tried to teach her about grace, but Paula," she encouraged the performance. I studied him. "And now you see the cost of that performance." He nodded slowly. "Please," he said after a moment, "let me make this right. Let me tell them who you are. They'll apologize. Dylan will understand." I held up my hand. "No, not yet. The truth is powerful, Robert, but it needs timing. If you hand it to people too soon, they'll treat it like gossip. Let them discover it themselves." He frowned. "But Jessica, she'll destroy herself when she finds out." I smiled slightly. "Then maybe she'll finally learn what destruction feels like before she causes more of it." He looked at me for a long time, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "You're not the woman I expected." "Few people ever see the real thing when they're busy staring at gold," I said. When he left, I closed the door gently and stood in the stillness of my small house. I could feel the balance of power shifting not from me, but back toward the truth that had always been waiting. Later that afternoon, I heard Dylan's car pull into the driveway. He didn't knock. He opened the door, face pale, eyes wide. "Mom," he said breathlessly. "What's going on?" "Jessica's crying. Her father told her something about you, about his company." I poured him tea. The same way I did when he was a boy. "Sit down, sweetheart." He sat, confused, impatient. "Is it true? You own the Reynolds business?" I met his eyes. "Yes." He stared at me as though I had said I could move mountains. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't something you needed to carry," I said softly. "I wanted you to build your life from your own strength, not my shadow." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Jessica feels humiliated. She says everyone will think she married me for money." I took a long breath. "Then perhaps she'll finally experience what humiliation feels like. It has a way of cleaning a person, if they let it." He exhaled, torn between loyalty and disbelief. "She's not a bad person, Mom. She just cares too much about appearances." I looked at him tenderly. "Appearances fade, Dylan. Character stays. The question is whether she has any left when the shine is gone." He fell silent, his eyes dropping to the cup in front of him. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "Nothing yet," I said. "I'll let truth do its work." The next day, my phone rang. Jessica's number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Her voice was thin, trembling. "Emily, can we talk?" I agreed to meet her at the cafe downtown, the one where people go to be seen. She arrived late, sunglasses hiding eyes swollen from tears. The confident tone she once used had vanished. She sat across from me, silent for a moment, before whispering, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Would you have treated me differently if I had?" I asked. She hesitated. "Maybe." "I didn't need maybe," I said. "I needed honesty, and now you have yours." She looked down. "I was wrong. I was awful to you." "Yes," I said simply. "You were." Her lips quivered. "Everyone knows now." "My parents told their friends. Reporters might find out. They'll think I married into money, not love." I studied her carefully. "Then show them they're wrong." She looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean fix it, Jessica. Prove that you can be more than your last name, more than the dress, the house, the spectacle. This isn't about me, it's about you. You mocked a woman for being small, and now you'll learn what it's like to stand in the shadow of someone you dismissed." Tears spilled silently down her cheeks. "I don't know how." "Then start with an apology," I said. She nodded slowly, trembling. "Will you forgive me?" I leaned back. "Forgiveness isn't free, Jessica. It has to cost something. That's how you know it's real." When I stood to leave, she reached for my hand, but I pulled away gently. "This isn't punishment," I said. "It's perspective." I walked out of the cafe and into the bright afternoon, the air sharp and clean. My reflection in the window caught my eye: plain dress, calm face, silver hair. The woman Jessica called a nobody had become the quiet storm that could unmake her world with a signature. But I didn't need to. The truth was already doing it for me. As I crossed the street, my phone buzzed again, an email from my lawyer confirming the meeting I'd requested with the Reynolds board. Subject line: ownership review. It was time to stop hiding in plain sight. The war, Jessica started with her words, was about to end not with revenge, but revelation. In the days that followed, whispers began to spread quietly through the city, like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. The truth had escaped its cage, and no one could unhear it. The Reynolds family, once so composed and unshakable, now lived under the uneasy weight of curiosity. Reporters called it an anonymous investor's comeback, but I didn't correct them. I wasn't returning. I had never left. That week, I did what I'd always done best, prepared in silence. I opened the drawers of my desk, took out the old contracts, trust papers, and legal agreements that had kept my husband's vision alive. Each document carried the quiet proof of my authority. I owned more than they ever imagined. My lawyer, Thomas Gray, came by one morning with his briefcase and calm eyes. He had worked with me for nearly 2 decades and understood that I preferred to move without noise. After scanning through the Reynolds portfolio, he looked up and said, "You could take full control if you wished, replace the board, sell the shares, rename the company." I shook my head. "I don't want their ruin, Thomas. I want clarity." He nodded, his tone respectful but curious. "Then you'll have to attend the quarterly review in person. The board should hear the truth from the woman who owns them." I smiled faintly. "Then it's time they learn who's been keeping the lights on." When he left, I stood at the window, watching children ride their bicycles past my garden gate. Their laughter carried across the air with that careless lightness of those who've never been watched by the world. I envied them for a moment, the same way Jessica once pitied me. Later that evening, Dylan came by. He looked tired, guilt, and confusion sitting heavy in his expression. "Mom," he said softly, taking a seat at the kitchen table, "Jessica's been crying for days. She says people are treating her differently. I think she regrets what she did." I stirred the soup on the stove. "Regret is only useful when it changes behavior," I replied. He hesitated. "She's scared. She thinks you'll destroy her family's reputation." I turned to him and met his eyes. "If I wanted to destroy them, Dylan, I wouldn't need to lift a finger. Pride is a structure that collapses on its own. I just have to let gravity do its work." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You sound like Dad." The words caught me off guard, soft but cutting through the years. I smiled faintly. "Do I?" He nodded. "He used to say time was the best accountant. It always balances the books." I felt something stir in my chest, a quiet ache of recognition. "He was right," I said. "And I've been patient long enough to know it." That night, when the house had gone still, I sat at my desk once more. I didn't need numbers this time. I needed resolve. I thought about what mattered most: to protect Dylan, to honor Andrew's legacy, and to preserve the peace I had built in silence. Everything else could fall away, and I would not grieve for it. The next morning, I opened the wardrobe and chose a black suit that had once belonged to Andrew. Years ago, I had it tailored to fit me, though I'd never worn it. As I buttoned the jacket, I felt his presence there, steady and patient, like a hand resting on my shoulder. I wore no jewelry except my wedding band, the single promise I had never broken. At Reynolds Energy headquarters, the receptionist blinked when she saw my name on the visitor list. "Mrs. Emily Collins?" she asked, her voice small. "As in?" I smiled gently. "As in the majority shareholder." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. The elevator ride to the top floor was quiet. My reflection stared back at me in the mirrored walls, silver hair pinned neatly, calm eyes, posture straight. People often mistake gentleness for submission, but true strength rarely needs to shout. The boardroom smelled faintly of coffee and old ambition. 12 faces looked up as I entered, some curious, others already uneasy. Robert was there, seated at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. When he saw me, he rose. "Mrs. Collins," he said with quiet respect. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, taking the seat beside him. A man across the table frowned. "I thought Mrs. E. Collins was a trust entity," he said. "She is," I answered evenly, "and I am the entity." The silence that followed was sharp and clean, like glass breaking under pressure. Robert took a slow breath and addressed the room. "As many of you know, 15 years ago our company was saved by a private investor. What you didn't know is that the investor still holds controlling shares." He turned toward me. "Mrs. Collins is that investor." A ripple of shock moved through the boardroom, papers shuffled, eyes darted, whispers began and died mid-sentence. I folded my hands and said quietly, "There's no need for alarm. I have no intention of replacing anyone or changing what works. I only came to ensure the company remembers its purpose to provide light, not just profit." The words landed heavier than I intended. No one dared to interrupt. For the next hour, I listened as they discussed financial forecasts and marketing strategies. When I spoke, it was only to clarify, to remind them that efficiency without ethics was failure in disguise. And when I finished, the room stayed silent not because they feared me, but because they finally saw me. That evening, as the sun slipped below the skyline, I returned home to find an envelope tucked beneath my door. My name was written in careful, uncertain script. Inside was a note. "Emily, I want to meet you again, this time to listen. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you understanding. Jessica." I held the paper for a long moment before setting it on the table. I didn't know whether she truly meant it or if guilt had dressed itself up as sincerity. But perhaps, I thought, this was the beginning of something neither of us expected, not reconciliation, but recognition. I poured a cup of tea and watched the street lamps flicker on one by one. Their light spread slowly, steady and deliberate, illuminating the quiet world outside. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace, not the kind that hides, but the kind that stands tall. Tomorrow, I would face them all. Tonight, I would rest in the strength of stillness, the power I had carried all along. When I arrived at the Reynolds estate the following evening, the house that once glowed with pride now felt heavy with unease. The fountains were still running, the chandeliers still burning, but the air itself had changed. Money can polish marble and pour wine, but it cannot hide shame. Robert met me at the door, his posture straight but his eyes tired. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I nodded. "I believe this conversation is long overdue." They were all waiting inside the family, the partners, the people who once looked at me and saw only modest fabric and plain shoes. Paula sat rigid on the couch, her diamond bracelet trembling each time she shifted. Jessica was beside her, pale, eyes rimmed red from days of sleeplessness. Dylan stood apart, hands in his pockets, torn between love and loyalty, between who he was and what he'd learned. The silence was thick. It wasn't awkwardness, it was consequence. I took the empty seat at the end of the long table, the same way I had once done in their ballroom, except this time, no one offered to seat me near the doors. They were watching me now, truly watching, the way people do when they realize they might have misjudged the ground beneath their feet. Robert cleared his throat first. "Jessica has something to say." Jessica swallowed hard. "Mrs. Collins," she began, her voice trembling, "I came here tonight to apologize." She paused, searching for words that had never come naturally to her. "What I said at the wedding was cruel. I was proud and thoughtless. I wanted everyone to see how perfect my life was, and I used you as a mirror to make myself feel bigger. I see now how small that was." I studied her, saying nothing. She continued, the tears finally breaking through her voice. "When I found out who you really were, what you'd done for my family, I felt sick. My father told me the truth. You didn't just save his company, you saved us. Everything I've built my life on exists because of your generosity, and I treated you like a stain on it." She wiped her cheek. "I don't know how to make that right." Robert leaned forward, his tone hushed but firm. "I told her the truth, Emily, every detail. About the investment, the shares, the contract, The board meeting today made it official. You hold majority control." Paula's breath caught. Her eyes darted between him and me, disbelief and fear warring on her face. "You mean," she said, her voice cracking, she could dissolve this family's business tomorrow," Robert finished. The words hung in the air like thunder without lightning. Jessica stared at me, her lips trembling. "Are you going to?" she whispered. I looked at her, at all of them, and felt something I hadn't expected. Compassion. Not forgiveness, not pity, but the calm that comes when truth has already done its work. "No," I said simply. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I came to return something you lost the chance to understand who you've become." Jessica blinked. "I don't understand." "You will," I said softly. "Because one day, you'll stand where I stood, and someone will look at you with the same kind of judgment you gave me. And in that moment, you'll remember tonight." Paula's voice trembled. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing," I said. "I already have everything I need. The papers, the ownership, the peace that comes with knowing I can end this whenever I choose. But I won't. Because I know that punishment without reflection is just vengeance, and I have no use for vengeance." Robert lowered his head. "You're a better person than we deserve." "I'm just a woman who remembers her promises," I said quietly. "I promised my husband I'd stay small in the world and large on paper. I kept that promise. But I've learned something new. Being large on paper isn't enough if you let small people define your worth." The clock ticked softly behind us. Jessica began to cry, silent tears sliding down her face. Dylan stepped forward then, his voice low but steady. "Mom," he said, "you've done enough. You don't have to prove anything anymore." I looked at him, my heart swelling with something deeper than pride recognition. "I'm not proving anything, Dylan. I'm teaching something." He nodded slowly, understanding at last. Then I turned back to Jessica. "There will be a settlement," I said. $5 million in trust, under your name. It's not a gift, and it's not revenge. It's a clean slate. You'll take it, leave Dylan, and start a life built on your own effort, not someone else's inheritance." Her eyes widened. "You're paying me to leave?" "I'm giving you a way to save face," I said evenly. "You can tell the world whatever story you like, but you'll know the truth that a woman you called a nobody gave you the only dignity you have left." For a long moment, no one breathed. Paula tried to speak, but Robert shook his head. Jessica stared at me with a mixture of shame and disbelief. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll take it," she whispered. "Good," I said, "because sometimes peace requires payment, and I've paid more than enough in silence." Dylan looked at her, then at me. His voice was quiet, heavy with understanding. "I'll file for divorce tomorrow." I stood, smoothing my jacket. "Do it with kindness," I said. "Don't let bitterness make your decisions. Let truth make them." When I walked toward the door, Robert followed me. "Emily," he said softly, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," I replied. "Just run your company with integrity. Make Andrew's light mean something again." Outside, the night air was cool, and the sky had that soft, bruised color that comes before dawn. I paused at the gate and looked back at the grand house, now quiet and still. The people inside had built their kingdom on vanity, and tonight they'd watched it crumble under the weight of truth. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. For the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't a shield, it was peace. I took a breath, long and steady, and whispered to the night, "It's over." Then I walked away, leaving behind the echoes of wealth and the ghosts of pride. Tomorrow, I would wake to a world that finally matched the one I'd been living in all along, simple, honest, and finally entirely mine. The morning after the confrontation, the world felt lighter, like the storm had finally passed. Sunlight streamed through my kitchen window, turning the dust motes into tiny flecks of gold. The house smelled of coffee and the faint sweetness of the garden outside. I sat at the same table where I had once cried over unpaid bills, where I had planned investments that changed the course of my life, and for the first time in years, I simply breathed without planning what came next. Dylan came by in the afternoon, carrying a box of photographs. He looked different now, calmer, older somehow, like a man who had walked through fire and come out knowing what burns and what doesn't. "I filed the papers this morning," he said quietly. Jessica didn't argue, she just signed. I nodded. "It's for the best." He placed the box on the table. "I found these when I was packing. They're from Dad's workshop." I opened it slowly. Inside were pictures of Andrew hunched over his invention, wires coiled across the table like veins of light. There were sketches, notes written in his crooked handwriting, and a photo of the three of us, young, tired, and happy. My eyes stung, but I smiled. "He'd be proud of you," I said. Dylan sat across from me, hands folded. "You know, Mom, all my life I thought you were just content. I didn't realize how much strength that takes." I laughed softly. "Contentment is the hardest armor to wear. People mistake it for weakness, but it's the only thing that can't be stolen." He reached across the table and took my hand. "I see that now." There was nothing more to say. Sometimes understanding doesn't come with words, it comes with silence that finally feels safe. Over the next few months, the world moved on. The Reynolds name appeared in the news a few times, Robert restructuring the company, Paula withdrawing from public events, Jessica vanishing quietly into another city. They never spoke of the settlement, and I never mentioned it. Some truths belong to silence. The company itself found its rhythm again. I let them run it, offering guidance only when it was needed. Robert began redirecting part of the profits to renewable energy programs in small towns, a promise he said he owed both to Andrew and to me. It was the first time I saw integrity grow out of embarrassment, and it suited him better than pride ever had. As for me, I chose peace over performance. I kept my small house, the same creaking floors, the same chipped teacups, the same garden that Andrew planted from seed. I started volunteering at the community workshop where young engineers tinkered with ideas that reminded me of him, messy, brilliant, unpolished hope. They didn't know who I was, and I didn't tell them. I preferred it that way. One boy brought me a blueprint for a solar-powered pump one afternoon and asked shyly, "Do you think it'll work?" I smiled. "It already does," I said. "You just haven't seen the light yet." Dylan visited often. We spent evenings cooking simple meals and talking about his new designs. He had taken on projects that focused on rebuilding old spaces, schools, shelters, community centers. "Buildings should make people feel safe," he said once. Not small. I looked at him then and realized he had learned everything I had ever hoped to teach, not from lectures, but from watching what love looks like when it endures humiliation and still refuses to bend. One quiet Sunday, as twilight spread across the sky, I took my tea out to the porch. The air was soft, the kind of calm that carries no promises and no regrets. I thought about Jessica, not with bitterness, but with a strange sort of gratitude. Some people enter our lives to remind us what we never want to become. She had given me that clarity. And in her own way, she had given Dylan back to me. I looked at the horizon, where the last light of day met the first stars of night. The hum of the small generator beside the house filled the air, the same invention that had built my life, carried my grief, and now powered my peace. I whispered to the empty porch, "We made light, Andrew. And it's still shining." For a long moment, I sat there in the quiet, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into something softer, something whole. I had won without vengeance, healed without noise, and proved without ever having to say a word that the most elegant revenge is living truthfully, peacefully, and without masks. When the first cool wind of evening brushed against my skin, I smiled, closing my eyes. I had nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. The world finally looked the way I had always seen it, honest, imperfect, and full of quiet grace. If Emily's story stayed with you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Don't forget to subscribe and share this story with someone who believes quiet women can't change the world. Your support keeps these voices alive.